Hey, so this is a new video with a new system. So now, from now on, if you want to follow along with the notes that I'm reading off of, I will leave a link in the description. It should be available to everyone. And yeah, we're going to get started with the historical notes or dates for this poetry desk. So, in 1803, the United States purchased Louisiana Territory. Thomas Jefferson, I think it was 15.3 million, something quite small in comparison to what it's become. And by 1810, America has 17 states and 7 million inhabitants. 1730, the Indian Removal Act, and that brings us to did I say 1730? I meant 1830. That brings us to 1835, where the Trail of Tears is happening. So this was when 15,000 Cherokee Indians were forced to leave, and a third of them did die. 1848, you strike gold, and in 1848, the suffrage movement, women's suffrage, the suffragette movement comes to America. 1849, people rush to California to get gold, hence the name the 49ers. If you're football, but if you're not, you become known as the 49ers. 1851, the Fugitive Slave Law and the Burns fugitive slave case, which takes place a little bit later. They occurred during that period. It's basically up till that point, if you escaped to a free state, you were free if you were a slave. This case meant that anyone who was a slave and went to a free state wasn't really safe. There was no safe haven if you were a slave. So like the Underground Railroad kind of ends at that point, because it doesn't matter how north you go unless you're going to Canada, which has a totally separate set of laws. So 1861, we have 34 states and 31 million inhabitants, and this is the start of the Civil War. New York is also the most densely populated city, largely due to Ellis Island. It is the island all immigrants coming from the other side of the Atlantic enter America through. Transportation notes and dates. The 1800s, assembly lines established. If you don't know what an assembly line is, it's a bunch of people doing one small job to make one big thing. So you want to build a calculator. I put in a button, the person next to me puts in a button, I just keep putting in the same button, and eventually we'll have calculators 30 people down the assembly line. 1825, the Erie Canal was finished. This went from Albany, I believe, to Lake Erie, which is one of the Great Lakes, if you didn't know. 1829, we have this is sort of like the the Industrial Revolution kind of period. Cotton gin, sewing machine, and telegraph all invented. 1850s, the development of the railroad system. 1866, Atlanta, the Transcontinental Railroad. The one that they wanted to make a railroad that went from Savannah to the West Coast. Those were starting to be completed. 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was finished. Literature of the period. So, we talk about Romanticism. Up until this point in American literature, everything has sort of been about laws or just the idea of America. Romanticism is the first creative period in American literature. We have the Federalist Age that took place during the Revolutionary War, and we have three important figures that survived the Federalist age: Bryant, Irving, and Cooper. Then emerging as new writers who are novelists, we have Hawthorne, Melville, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. The poets, we have Poe, Whittier, Holmes, Longfellow, Lowell, Dickinson, and Whitman. The essayists, we have Thoreau, Emerson, and Holmes, and the critics, Poe, Lowell, and Sims. Now we're going to move on to Edgar Allan Poe. Philosophies. Poe believed that a story should have a certain number of characteristics to make it the best story it could be. So his short story theory, writer should form the effect before the plot, and all within that story should support the effect, right? And the story should be short enough to read in one sitting, which is ironic because some of Poe's stories are a little lengthy. And the first sentence is super crucial in establishing the effect. Moving on to poetry. Now this is kind of a longer philosophy, but a lot of the points are just simpler. So the effect should be original and vivid. It should be no longer than 100 lines, which again is irony because Poe wrote poems that were longer than 100 lines. The Bells is longer than 100 lines, I believe. But anyways, he said this because he believed that it should be short enough for one sitting, but long enough in the sense that it will elevate the psyche, like it will make you think. Typical subject should be beauty, and the tone should be melancholy. It's kind of like a sadness, which was really common in poetry if you read that. The saddest sounds are O and R. The theme is death of a beautiful woman. Speaker should be the bereaved lover. And that kind of ends up the philosophy. So, Poe's style. Poe's style was Gothic. Water bottle is not smothered. Poe wrote in a macabre mood, an appropriate setting, goriness, mutilation, Gothic characters, grotesque, which is physical suffering, and or arabesque, which is mental suffering. We'll get to those two words later. He invented the detective/rational tales, and he is the first to devise this genre. Now, there were six themes in Poe's writing. The struggle of the soul versus the physical senses. 2 is compulsion. 3 is guilt and fear. 4 is appearance versus reality. 5 is ill health affects monomania of the protagonist. And 6 is catharsis at the end, is often dramatic and deadly. Now, one of the big poems that Poe wrote is The Fall of the House of Usher. So, in terms of characters, we have the unnamed narrator, we have Roderick Usher, and Madeline. So, basically, short summary of the story. The unnamed narrator gets a letter from Roderick Usher saying, and the letter says that, I'm depressed, and some stuff's happening, my sister's sick. Sister is Madeline. She is sick, and there's a lot of incest going on in the Usher household. That's the impression that we get as readers, and they are the last 2 Ushers. And so, long story short, they think Madeline dies. She comes back to life, escaping her coffin somehow. and then she dies and kills Roderick Usher by falling on him. And we get the sense that Madeline is also a small girl, so it's not like she crushed him because she was fat. I asked that question in class. And then the unnamed narrator bolts out of the house, and as he watches the house, as he leaves, he sees the house crumble. And this is the double meaning, which we'll talk about, of the title, The Fall of the House of Usher. But anyways, Roderick's song, entitled The Haunted Palace, it echoes the generation of both the house of Usher and its inhabitants. I mean, everyone's kind of creepy and a little haunted. And the House of Usher used to be respected, and now it's just a shell of its former self, and it's overgrown, it's breaking down, and it's just only, like I said, there was only 2 people left, Roderick and his sister. Now, the narrator's story. To entertain Roderick, the narrator tells a story about a knight who fights a dragon, and all of the sounds of the story correspond to Madeline breaking out of a coffin, which is a coffin inside of a vault, hidden, or kept safe by a 2 feet thick iron door. She escapes. We don't know how. So underlying metaphors. So the physical house or mansion not only stands for the Usher family, but it exhales the dynasty of the Ushers as its very breath. Towards the end, I said that the house crumbles, and the title is The Fall of the House of Usher. So the title has a double meaning, as it's both the physical house that falls at the end and the family tree that falls as Roderick and Madeline die, ending the bloodline. Alright, the Telltale Heart. So this follows follows an unnamed narrator who insists on his sanity after murdering an old man with a vulture eye, because he's obsessed with his eye, but he's not crazy. And the murder is carefully calculated. He's very precise. And then he hides the the corpse or I should say the pieces of the corpse. He cut him up and then hid him under his floorboards in his house. Then the cops show up to ask if he'd heard anything about it, and he cracks, and he gives in and tells and confesses. Mask of the Red Death. So, major overall allegory, the fact that you can't escape death. We see the Prince Prospero, who we believe is represented in this story, tried to hide from an epidemic within his castle, surrounded by walls and whatnot, and eventually the epidemic gets in within the walls somehow, and everyone dies. So allegorical symbols. We have the walls, multicolored rooms, especially the black one, because the black one kind of represents death and no one goes in that room. And the clock. The bells. So summary, each bell represents a new stage of life. Each stanza gets longer as life gets shorter. So we start off with childhood, silver bells, then gold bells is marriage, and then I think it's brazen bells and iron bells. There's a lot of onomatopoeia, alliteration, repetition, and assonance, which we're gonna discuss what all of those words mean, or at least some of them. Some of them I'm expecting you to know if you're in 10th grade and you're watching this. At least Jordan Tovin, you should know this. Key phrases, really just bells, bells, bells. That's just part of the repetition. Each stanza ends with bells, 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 bells. And the tone is kind of sad. It's upbeat at first, yet because of the longer stanzas towards the end of the poem, it puts more of an emphasis on death and just the sadness of death. And the theme it's just an allegory for the seasons of life, really. Moving on to Annabelle Lee. This is a beautiful, in summary, it's a beautiful, painful memory. And the speaker of the poem is remembering his long-lost love. Literary devices, rhyme and meter. We don't really see anything else. This is sort of a shorter poem, I want to say. Some key phrases are "in this kingdom by the sea." The tone is sad as the boy dreams about a girl who died of frostbite, and the theme is love, obviously. Raven. Now moving on to the Raven. This is the summary. The unnamed narrator is alone in his house on a cold December evening, and he's trying to read, and all of a sudden he hears a quiet knock and realizes that it is a raven, and he thinks it's an angel, or he says that he has been reading in hopes of relieving his sorrow over Eleanor, his beloved wife who passed away. And he goes mad because the raven gives the same response, nevermore, throughout the entire poem. Literary devices, we have alliteration, rhyme, onomatopoeia, assonance, and repetition. Some key phrases are keep into that darkness peering. Long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming, dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. Quoth the raven nevermore. And the tone is dark and melancholic. We see melancholy a lot with Poe. He's really dark. Even the one that you think is somewhat nice, it's somehow dark and twisted. Theme is grief, negativity, and oppression. And moving on to Helen. Summary is basically the narrator praises Helen for her beauty, and he takes 15 lines to do so, by the way. So, very pretty. Literary devices, the metaphors and allusions to the Bible and Greek Roman mythology. The key phrases are psyche, from the regions which are Holy Land. The tone is infatuation and romance, and the theme is the beauty of a woman. Washington Irving, he was a transitional writer from revolutionary to romantic. He wrote The Devil and Tom Walker. Some characters. Tom Walker, the first and foremost outrageously self-destructively greedy. He despises his merely abusive wife and has nothing to live for but the satisfaction of his desire for owning things. Old Scratch is basically the devil. Tom Walker's wife died while trying to find treasure and found with her heart in her apron. Just her apron is found with her heart inside. Captain Kidd is the pirate who planted this treasure. Deacon Peabody is the owner of a swamp. And his name is carved into a tree. Absalom Crowninshield is the person whose name is carved into the fallen tree. And we also know that once a tree is chopped down by Old Scratch or the devil, that person dies. The land jobber, he gets rich fast off of buying and selling land. So, foreshadowing. It's really the old rotten tree is the main foreshadowing in this poem. It was described as good on the outside, but it's really rotten in the inside. We see this sort of with Tom Walker, was also rotten on the inside after he sold his soul to the devil, basically. And yeah, we also know that Tom Walker dies at the end. So, chopped down tree, gone. Symbols: the trees in the forest, the heart, the swamp itself, representing Tom's immoral services. And now we're going to move on to the end, because we do not know enough about William Cullen Bryant yet. So we're going to get that information tomorrow. And vocab. So we're going to focus on just the important terms. So we have assonants. They're the repetition of a sound or a vowel. Consonants is the recurrence of similar sounds, especially consonants in close proximity. You can remember assonant starts with a vowel, and consonant sounds like consonant, and it starts with a consonant. Now we're going to move on to types of rhymes. Rhymes, we have internal, a rhyme involving a word in the middle of a line and another at the end of the line or in the middle of the text. We have end rhyme, which is the last syllables or words in two or more lines rhyme with each other. And then slant is the words that have similar but not identical sounds. Think of rap. And an I rhyme, which is basically a similarity. Uh-oh. We're missing some. Hold on.